morning. I'm Kim McCleary, President and CEO of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. Thank you all so very much for joining us today. During these challenging times, we have pivoted so that all of our programming is now via live streams with the same excellent national and international speakers you have always come to love and enjoy. But we can't do this without your help. Please consider becoming a member of the Council or by making a contribution by visiting our website at lawac.org. I'm very happy to introduce today's program, our Politics in the Time of Coronavirus series with politics professor Dan Schnur. Today's focus, the new isolationism, why the US is turning inward, and what are we missing? Dan, we're so looking forward to today's discussion. I turn it over to you. Thank you so much for coming.
Kim, thanks so much for having me. And thanks to all of you who joined us for today's program. As most of you know, last year, the LA World Affairs Council and LA Town Hall, two longtime extremely respected community outreach organizations in the Los Angeles area, decided to merge. And most of the programming that we've done to date, at least as part of this podcast, as part of this webinar, has focused on American domestic politics for obvious reasons. But as I think most of you know also, LA World Affairs Council has a particularly rich history in the area of the international relations. And so today, in the spirit of this joint partnership that Town Hall and LA World Affairs Council have come together on, we're going to take a little bit more of an international perspective on the discussion. And over the course of today, we're going to talk about three main topics before we open it up to your questions and insights. So as has been advertised, we're going to talk about the new isolationism. Is the global pandemic response leaving the US behind? Second, we're going to talk about the relationship between US and China. And we touched on this a little bit last week, but I want to get into it in a little bit more depth today, because given the number of questions that many of you had about it that we didn't get to last week, it seemed reasonable to come back so we could talk about it for a somewhat more extended period of time. And then third, because of course this is politics in the time of coronavirus, we will talk about campaign 2020, particularly the presidential campaign, and the framing of the decision that's coming before American voters. That decision, not just Trump and Biden, but the broader discussion in the time of pandemic, the broader decision in the time of pandemic, health versus jobs, which needs to come first. So let's start out by talking about this new isolationism. And as we'll discuss in a minute or two, what we'll realize is that this new isolationism really isn't that new. So we're going to start out this week. I'm going to give you a little bit of overview before we delve in more deeply. This past Monday, just a few days ago, there was a virtual global summit held to discuss a coordinated effort to find vaccines for the coronavirus, to fund that effort, and then to discuss equitable and organized distribution of those vaccines when they are found, to avoid competition between the countries and other potentially hazardous impacts of an unorganized global response. So who was there? Who participated in this virtual global summit? Angela Merkel was there from Germany, Emmanuel Macron from France, Boris Johnson from Great Britain, Shinzo Abe from Japan, Justin Trudeau from Canada, even Bibi Netanyahu and President Erdogan from Israel and from Turkey. Bill and Melinda Gates were there representing their foundation, as were other philanthropic leaders from around the world. China, at the last minute, pulled out their senior level representation and sent a mid-level bureaucrat. Who wasn't there? The United States government. There was no representative of either the Trump administration or of Congress at this global session. And while, to be fair to our country's leadership, while the US has given significant amounts of aid to global health efforts, the message of the lack of US representation at this important summit was an important one. Like I said, to be fair, the United States has donated a great deal of money to international efforts, But not only did our country not take a leadership role in this coordinated global conversation, but didn't even attend. Both the G7 and the G20 meetings that took place earlier this spring on the pandemic ended in gridlock, largely because of hardline pushback from Trump administration representatives. And of course, we're familiar with the administration's decision to withdraw from the World Health Organization. So now at this point, it'd be pretty easy, pretty facile, simply to blame Donald Trump and then to move on. But as we've talked about in so many other circumstances, here as well, often Donald Trump is as much a symptom of broader national feelings as a cause of them. And I think it's important to realize before we continue to condemn this administration from its lack of involvement in global anti-pandemic efforts, to recognize that the growing isolationism and nationalism in the United States was apparent long before 2016. Now, of course, it's not unique to the United States either. We see this type of isolationism, this type of nationalism in many of the Western democracies. The Golden Dawn movement in Greece, the ADP in Germany, the National Front in France, the Law and Justice Party in Poland, and of course in Great Britain, Brexit. Now these sentiments are, and so all throughout the West, we're seeing countries pre-pandemic that were beginning to withdraw from international engagement because of increasingly strong populist movements in those countries. Now, as I said earlier, those sentiments aren't new here either. It's worth remembering that back in the 2016 elections, not just Trump, but Hillary Clinton too, both opposed the Trans-Pacific Partnership that the Obama administration had worked hard to develop, and they received very strong support from Barack Obama's president, George W. Bush. Part of Bernie Sanders' appeal in the Democratic primary that year and this year has been criticism of trade agreements' impact on manufacturing jobs, a criticism remarkably like the one that candidate Trump in 2016 and President Trump in 2020 are offering. In 2016, early that year, long before either party's nomination was settled, the Los Angeles Times USC poll that I ran at that time, the LA Times USC poll in 2016 was asked about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And when the terms of the agreement, the relationship between the United States and more than a dozen other countries on both sides of the Pacific designed to enhance trading relationships, once the proposed agreement was explained to the respondents, only 25% of California voters supported that trade agreement. Our poll also showed that large majorities of Californians thought that increased trade with other countries had cost US jobs and had lowered US wages. And I have to admit, I was struck by these responses. These were not people being polled from the Rust Belt, from northern Ohio, from southern Michigan, from my home state of Wisconsin. This is California, the capital of the Pacific Rim. And even here, while Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders were running in their respective party primaries for president, even in California, suspicion and hostility toward expanded trade and expanded economic engagement with the rest of the world was growing. So let's fast forward to today. A few weeks ago, the president announced that he intended to suspend all immigration into the United States during the coronavirus pandemic. Now, the executive order that he ultimately issued fell a little bit short of that, but that was the original announcement: suspend all immigration into the US during the pandemic. So our first poll question, Claire, if you're willing to put it up, the first poll question I'm going to ask you guys today is, what do you think of that proposal? Should the US halt immigration into the country until the COVID-19 crisis has subsided? And obviously we'd like you to select one of the following, yes or no. What I will tell you, as you're casting your votes, is the Washington Post and the University of Maryland, which do a very well-respected national poll, polled on this question also. They asked their respondents if they supported or opposed a halt in immigration during the pandemic. What the Washington Post poll showed is that 65% of Americans supported the idea of a freeze on legal immigration into the United States, legal immigration into the United States. 80% of Republicans supported that halt, but so did 49% of Democrats, roughly half of Democrats sampled. Interestingly, so did more than 60% of non-white respondents. So let's see your responses. Claire, can you put those up on the screen for us? Much different than the nation as a large. Members of an organization like this one, particularly in Southern California, come out on the other end from the national response. Here, 25% of you said that immigration should be halted during the time of pandemic. 75% said no, which is almost a precise, exact reversal of what those poll numbers show on a national level, which I would argue somewhat underscores the point that I've been making, is that even though you and I might see the benefits, the tremendous benefits of increased international engagement on trade, on immigration, and other issues, the United States as a whole, particularly during this coronavirus crisis, is thinking in a much different direction. Historically, this isolationist trend is inevitable. If you look back over the last century or so, after every major war, after every major economic downturn, we as a country have turned inward. We did so after World War I, again after World War II, after Vietnam, after Iraq, and what the poll numbers I talked about earlier showed, even from a few years ago, is that while the Afghanistan war, the longest war in American history, continued, and in the aftermath of the unsatisfying and uneven recovery to the Great Recession, historically, it shouldn't be surprising that these isolationist tendencies are rising, and both Trump in one party and Sanders in the other took advantage of them. But let's take a look at those two post-World War periods for a minute. After World War I and after World War II, at both points, there were very strong isolationist sentiments in this country, understandably. After a long and costly and debilitating war, people wanted to come home and wanted to look inward. But a big contrast, which I would argue to you is instructive for us as a country today looking forward. After World War I, the US withdrew from the rest of the world. Our leaders followed public opinion. As a result, the League of Nations failed. Germany was harshly punished, given its role in World War I, and resentment in that country grew. The Great Depression distracted us as a country, as Hitler and Tojo and Mussolini expanded power in their respective countries. And that isolationism inarguably laid the groundwork for an even uglier and nastier and more costly World War. After World War II, by comparison, while US public opinion still opposed international engagement, our country's leadership thought otherwise. We stayed engaged. The United Nations was formed. The Marshall Plan, the rebuilding of Germany and Japan, all took place in the face of domestic political resistance. Now, granted, the Cold War provided a common foe and some inspiration, but still, our reaction to the aftermath of World War I and World War II is clear. And I think it's going to be instructive in a post-pandemic era as we struggle to overcome today's current isolationist tendencies. So let's go on for a couple minutes and talk about the US versus China. And we did talk about this last week, so I won't spend much time on it, unless, of course, it's something that all of you want to talk about in your questions. And we'll be going to your questions in about 5 or 6 minutes. Jessica DeGanzik, as Kim mentioned, is standing by, and I can tell that many of you have already sent questions in. But let's talk about China for just a couple minutes too. So we did discuss this last week. We discussed about how the relationship between the United States and China was already worsening before the pandemic, but the debate over the virus is making it much worse. Public opinion polls show that US voters' trust for the Chinese government is down 20 points over the last few years and at its lowest level since polling began on this topic in the early 2000s. The United States is referring to this, or many of our leaders are referring to this as the Wuhan virus. There are Chinese government officials suggesting that the virus came from the US military. In particular, and we can talk more about them later, the Deputy National Security Advisor, Matt Pottinger, is a former Wall Street Journal Reuters reporter who covered China for those news organizations. And during his career as a journalist, came up firsthand against some of the very restrictionist, authoritarian attitudes that the Chinese government imposes in its country. And he's been a real key force in the Trump administration on this approach. Trump himself said last week that China's handling of the virus shows the Chinese want him to lose re-election. The Washington Post is reporting, as is the Wall Street Journal this morning, that not only that the White House and virtually every cabinet agency in the government are pondering aggressive moves against China on any number of fronts. And of course, there's now increasing concern, not just here in the United States, but elsewhere in the world, about whether China is being sufficiently forthcoming or cooperative on the origins and their early handling of the virus. And China is responding to that pressure and that criticism from other countries with very, very harsh pushback from its diplomats. So we talked last week about the potential makings of a new Cold War between US and China. And we'll get back to that in just a minute. But for right now, let's go to the next two poll questions. Claire, can you put up the first of the two? Question one, we're asking you, is the United States responding to China in an appropriate way? And we'd like you to tell us, is the US underreacting? Are we overreacting? Or are we reacting appropriately? Just a reminder, we will be going to your questions in just a few minutes. And Jessica, I think, has told all of you, we're hoping you can keep those questions concise for my sake, mainly. Claire, do we have responses yet to our first question here? We sure do. 10% say that US is underreacting to China. 58% say overreacting to China. 33% say reacting appropriately. So if you take those first two questions, the 10 to 58 split, once again, our participants are looking at this challenge in a fundamentally different way than voters across the country are. Because public opinion polling is showing that most voters would like to see the US be more aggressive in its response to China. So let's go on to the second question. Is it appropriate to refer to the coronavirus as, quote, the Chinese virus, unquote? Obviously, this is very provocative language that's come under some very significant criticism. On the other hand, as those who use the term point out, that unlike the Spanish flu in 1918, which did not originate in Spain, the so-called Chinese virus did originate in China. So what do you guys think? Is that an appropriate way to refer to the virus? 18% say yes, 82% say no. Once again, showing a very large divide between our participants and the broader electorate. Last point I want to make, the last topic I want to cover for just a minute or two, and then we'll get to your questions, is that I did want to talk at least briefly about the presidential election, because it's increasingly clear, as I mentioned earlier, that the debate in this election is going to be a very simple one. And the question that most American voters are going to be considering through the year and through the election is what's more important for us as a country as we continue to confront this pandemic. What's more important, health or jobs? Now, most Americans are leaning toward the option of health being more important. Most Americans, when it comes to the reopening, are saying slow down, that we're moving too fast. 2/3 of Americans, according to the Washington Post poll, 2/3 of Americans say they will not go to a retail clothing store, even when that's available to them. 3/4 say that they're not ready to go to a sit-down restaurant. So the protesters who we're seeing are a small minority. But on the other hand, more than 40 states are in the process of reopening or are moving quickly toward doing so this weekend. And those states are operating under governors from both the Republican and the Democratic Party. So I guess the question we'll put to you is, well, let's put the last question up if we can, Claire. Is the US moving toward reopening at the right speed? Tell us, is it too fast, too slow, or just right? And let's see if your responses jibe with those of the rest of the electorate. It is interesting, as we poll on this, that coronavirus cases are now rising most quickly in red America, in rural areas, ex-urban areas, and in Republican-leaning states. Up until now, the overwhelming majority of cases have been occurring in urban and suburban areas, communities that lean Democratic and voted for Hillary Clinton. In the weeks ahead, we'll see if the spread of the virus into those Republican-leaning areas affects public opinion. But at least for now, let's see what you guys think on that question. Too fast, too slow. 77% say too fast, 8% say too slow, 15% say just right. And on this question, our participants are almost completely in sync with that of the broader population. But right now, as all of you know, the president is a very strong advocate for reopening. As we've talked about before, we know that he can't get reelected. He knows that he can't get reelected with a weak economy. So if this push to reopen works, if the economy improves without new virus outbreaks, then he probably wins reelection. But if it turns out that the opening was too fast, as many of you think, if the virus spreads, then he'll probably lose. Think about this for a minute before we go to your questions. The economic numbers are grim. 3.2 million people filed for unemployment this past week. It was reported this morning. Now more than 30 million Americans filing for unemployment. When they announce the national unemployment rate tomorrow, it's expected to be upwards of 16%. But many think that rate is really at more than 20% and still growing at the highest level since the Great Depression. Another measure of economic impact, according to the Brookings Institute study, which came out this week, almost 1 in 5 children in this country are now suffering from food insecurity. The number is actually between 17 to 18%, and just to give you some context, that's between 2 and 3 times as high as those numbers were 2 years ago. So the economic impact is on business, it's on workers, it's on children as well. So while we do tend to think about the economic trouble as it may hurt the president's reelection, it is causing real pain. But most Americans, yourselves included, understand, I think correctly, that that economic pain is not going to be resolved until or unless the health concerns and challenges are overcome first. So Jessica, let's go to everyone else's questions. I've been talking long enough. Let's turn this into a conversation. What are we hearing from our participants?
Well, I'm going to take some of those questions on China first. The first one is, has the US lost the moral high ground in world opinion by abandoning aggressive efforts to address the repression in China of the Uyghurs, Chinese human rights advocates, the Tibetan Buddhists, Hong Kong freedom advocates, and the militarization of the South China Sea?
Well, it's a terrific question, and I think it puts the topic we've been talking about in a really smart context. Because as I mentioned briefly, and it's good that we're coming back to it, this dynamic existed before the coronavirus. And as is the case with so many challenges we face as a country, both foreign and domestic, the pandemic is, in addition to creating new challenges, is intensifying a lot of those that already existed. And so I think the premise of the questioner is exactly right. This was a challenge before a pandemic. And whether the question was human rights, whether it was relationships with Taiwan or Hong Kong, whether it was increasing concerns in the business community about economic piracy, it is very clear that US policy under both Democratic and Republican presidents has, in retrospect, not been sufficiently aggressive on China. We as a country, and I talked about this last week, our country's leaders of both parties have believed for more than 40 years now that increased engagement with China would encourage better behavior on democracy, on human rights, in playing by international economic rules. That's not the case. And so it's not surprising that the poll numbers that we cited earlier are showing increasing suspicion toward China. And nor should it be surprising that Donald Trump and Joe Biden this year, over the course of their campaign, will have a competition with the American people to demonstrate which one of them can be tougher on China.
Thank you. What are the implications if we continue to be bent on bringing down the political system in China and making a distinction between the Chinese people and the Chinese Communist Party?
Well, also, it's a very important question. And I think this is one of the real challenges we face in terms of domestic politics. I'm on the board of a terrific organization here in Los Angeles called Cause, the Center for Asians United for Self-Empowerment. And our members and the members of our Young Leaders program with whom I work are very concerned about increasingly strident language directed at Asian Pacific Islanders living in this country. And Representative Judy Chu of Monterey Park has been particularly vocal in pushing back against this. So what we're beginning to see, and I emphasize beginning, is more of an effort among more responsible leaders to draw a very critical distinction between the people of China and the governments and the party's leadership. But the effort to draw that distinction is of critical importance. One, because of the very, very important respect we need to show to Chinese people, both in this country and ours, but also for very practical political purposes, because we simply cannot afford, and I think you'd agree with me on this, Jessica, we simply cannot afford to allow China to turn into the type of partisan football that, for example, our country's relationship with Israel has become in the last few years. The challenge with China is too great. The stakes are too high for this to turn into a Democrat versus Republican argument. And unless we become more careful and exhibit more caution in drawing a distinction between the Chinese people and their government and the Communist Party's leadership, that's exactly what's going to happen.
Thank you. This is kind of a follow-up to what you just said. Given that the Cold War also gave politicians a threat around which to rally, is U.S. isolationism more likely than heavy-handed engagements for the U.S. to win against Russia and China and help allies like Israel?
Well, this is the real challenge, and this is the real danger, and we talked about it a little bit last week. The biggest difference between what may be the new Cold War and the one we faced in the second half of the 20th century is in the 20th century, both the United States and the Soviet Union worked very aggressively to excuse me. Worked very aggressively to develop diplomatic, economic, and military relationships with allies across the world. If the US enters a period of isolationism and pulls back from that global engagement, there's no question in my mind that the Chinese leadership is going to continue to engage very forcefully on an international basis, the way they were doing before the pandemic, in the way they are doing much more aggressively now. China's facing challenges from other countries on their responsibility here, but they're offering supplies and aid and other types of support to other countries, and they're leaning on those other countries very heavily through diplomatic means to encourage their support. I asked the question last week, will the US engage on the world stage, or will the American century that began after World War I end as a result of this global crisis? For those of you who haven't seen it yet, the former Australian Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, has an excellent piece in the new Foreign Affairs magazine, speculating on what a world would look like without either US or Chinese leadership. And just so you know, the phrase he uses is international anarchy.
Thank you. Wouldn't Trump's attempts to isolate China be more effective if done multilaterally with European countries as opposed to unilaterally? And you just kind of alluded to this. Why doesn't he even try to form coalitions?
Well, I mean, Trump made it clear, not just from the beginning of his presidency, but from the beginning of the campaign, that he finds a lot of these multinational entities to be more harmful to U.S. interests than helpful. Although it's worth noting, though, that even in this current crisis, the debate over the pandemic and Chinese role and responsibility to share information with the rest of the world, not all, but much of the rest of the world is being critical as well. We're hearing from Europe, we're hearing from other Asian countries, we're hearing from Latin American countries that China does have a responsibility to step up in a way that they haven't. The Chinese are being very dismissive of those efforts also. And the questioner is exactly right, that while there's no guarantee, in fact, it's fairly unlikely that the Chinese government would be more forthcoming if they were being pressured by a multinational effort that included or was led by the US. It's certainly that multinational effort would certainly have a much greater chance of success if the US were part of it. And while these nationalist, isolationist tendencies exist in both parties, it does appear, at least in this election, that an election of Joe Biden would signify a return to those efforts. But I do want to caution to say that's not a Republican versus Democrat divide. There are plenty of internationalists in both parties, plenty of isolationists in both. But in this particular election, I do believe that Biden would, and I think most of our participants would agree, that Biden does represent a turn back to a more participatory approach on the US's part. And I do think the benefits of that would be significant in this regard and many other.
Thank you. Can the US be protectionist and nationalist without being isolationist, dial back globalism without dumping it, and take China off the phony designation of a developing country?
So the questioner is absolutely right. Most of these questions, particularly complicated questions like this one, aren't either or. Although we, ironically enough, we push them into that direction with our poll, I suppose. But these aren't either or. The real answers usually are somewhere in between. But there still is a matter of emphasis. And while the questioner is right, that simply isolating ourselves from China is not going to be productive for us or the world, that more aggressive measures are necessary. So can you become protectionist without becoming isolationist? Theoretically, but it's a pretty slippery slope. In my own feeling as a committed free trader is that protectionism isn't just a first step toward isolationism, but it's a signifier of it. And while I do understand and agree with the importance for labor and environmental safeguards on trade, and most importantly, something we ignored through the 1990s and 2000s, a greater effort to retrain American workers who do suffer as a result of expanded free trade agreements, I do think the potential for protectionism on a slippery slope to turn into much broader isolationism is a considerable one. So I understand the questioner's premise, but I would be nervous about attempting to cut back in terms of economic engagement while still maintaining engagement on other levels. Two, because you can't view those two levels of engagement completely separate from each other. They are interrelated. And second, because I don't think an economic disengagement with the rest of the world is a good idea. Trade precautions are good ideas, but trade withdrawal is a bad one.
All right. What is the best way to convey to Americans that on issues like vaccine development, climate change, and many other issues, international engagement will make them safer?
Boy, it's a terrific question, and there's not an easy answer. Populism is on the rise in this country, in both parties, as it is in so many other countries. And populist sentiments as a whole are not a bad thing. But when those populist sentiments manifest themselves as they have into parochialism and nationalism and isolationism, that does get dangerous. In years past, I would have said that the best way to push back against that was through bipartisan efforts. In other words, if we were to see not just the President of the United States who was interested in international engagement, or leadership of the opposition party with the same interest standing together, that would be a way of doing it. So in other words, you're not just seeing a Republican president and a Democratic speaker each talking about it, they're talking about it together and saying there are a lot of things we disagree on in this country, but we both agree that the US must play a vital role in the rest of the world. Even if we had a president and congressional leadership willing to do that, I don't know if today that would work because, as I said earlier, the splits within both the Democratic and the Republican Party are so profound that if, for example, Joe Biden and Mitt Romney or John Boehner and Nancy Pelosi were to talk about the benefits of this type of approach, they're leaving out wide swaths of the base of the Democratic Party and of the Republican Party. I don't think there's a magic answer to this. I don't think there's a fast answer to this. The best education effort probably then comes not from our political leaders, but from our employers. And if you think about those populist sentiments coming to a large degree from workers who feel like their livelihoods are being threatened by international competition, there needs to be a business labor cooperative effort to tell American workers, both on the right and on the left, that this is actually something that works for them and not against them. That kind of coordination is pretty difficult to imagine on this kind of political landscape. But in the long run, even more than Republican and Democrat cooperation, I think the kind of message the questioner is asking about needs to come from business labor cooperation instead.
Thank you. The Trans-Pacific Partnership was intended by Obama and the Democrats to confront China, but no one, not even Trump, understood this. They thought TPP was cooperating with China. What really happened?
Well, what really happened is fairly simple. The leaders of both parties felt that the Trans-Pacific Partnership, as the questioner implies, was designed to, I'd go a step further, almost to surround China. If we were to form more, if we were to form stronger trade relationships with other countries throughout the Pacific Rim, it would at least theoretically encourage China to improve its behavior to become part of the organization, or more likely, isolate them for refusing to improve their international economic practices. And what happened, of course, is any number of very strong voices in both parties, Trump on one side, Sanders on the other, many of other leaders in both parties, did turn it into much more of an accommodationist argument. And although President Obama did not back down from his support of it, it is instructive that Secretary Clinton did. And when you have a general election between two opponents of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, it's unlikely to get the kind of broad-based popular support for international engagement that we were talking about with the previous questioner. There's just one more point I'd make before we go on to the next question. This is not meant to blame Secretary Clinton. It's not meant to blame the many leading Republicans who ran for president in 2016 who had histories as internationalists. But I think that both Clinton on the Democratic side and Bush and Rubio and plenty of others on the Republican side were taken aback by the strength of the populist sentiment, and framing that as an anti-China argument ultimately did carry the day.
Thank you. How is the pandemic impacting Brexit?
How is the pandemic impacting Brexit? Well, first is, and I'm guessing most of you know, that Great Britain is now suffered more cases of the virus than any European country, and so its economic challenges have become much more considerable since the Brexit began to move forward. It is notable that earlier this week, British and U.S. negotiators announced that they were looking to move forward more purposefully toward a bilateral trade agreement between the two countries. And it's both Boris Johnson's and Donald Trump's hope that a U.S.-British trade agreement can provide a lot of the economic sustenance for Great Britain that Brexit was designed to do. At this immediate moment, though, what the pandemic has done, not just in Great Britain, but everywhere, is it has so dramatically reduced international trade that I don't know that the British economy is suffering more because of Brexit now than it would otherwise, because either way trade has been so diminished because of the pandemic. Where the Brexit will become a much bigger problem for the British economy, though, is not during the pandemic, but during the economic recovery that will hopefully follow. A more robust trading relationship with other countries would almost certainly help Britain out of its current economic straits. And so when we do turn the page on this crisis, I think a British trade agreement with the U.S. may help but it's not going to replace the economic growth that a non-Brexit British-European relationship could have led to.
Thank you. Not necessarily a question, but interested to hear Dan's thoughts on how the American lifestyle and the low cost of virtually all of our consumer goods is due to the Chinese manufacturing base that we basically set up. People here as a whole appear to either not understand that or underestimate how China has been an enabler of American life as we know it.
Well, I think the enabling, it's a fascinating point. I think the enabling goes in both directions. China has been more than happy to subsidize a lot of our low-cost economic growth and increased purchasing power. On the other hand, we as a country have enabled ourselves. In other words, in order to enjoy the lower prices that we can get through Chinese-produced goods as opposed to those we would produce domestically, the trade-off on that has been, going back to an earlier questioner's point, that we're more and more willing to overlook Chinese excesses in other ways. Human rights violations, lack of democracy, increasingly aggressive action in the South China Sea, and otherwise. Getting the cheaper goods is something that's helped fuel a U.S. economic, a period of U.S. economic growth. But it has come with trade-off. And while China is enabling us, I think to a large degree we're enabling ourselves. And while it may cause a rise in consumer prices in a post-pandemic world, the current discussions about moving a lot of offshore manufacturing capacity back to the United States is something that would address that situation for both the good and the bad. On one hand, it might help equalize the relationship between the two countries, but it would, make no mistake about it, result in higher consumer prices. And that would obviously take a toll not just on us individually and as families, but more broadly on the U.S. economy.
Thank you. Do you think there is a danger of backing China into a corner and increasing the chance of armed conflict?
Well, I don't know enough to talk about the potential, for military action. But I do know that the language between the two countries, as we talked about earlier, has grown increasingly bellicose, not just during the pandemic period, but in the years leading up to it. It's very clear that China is very, very aggressively increasing its military capability and capacity, and it's becoming increasingly assertive in other parts of the Pacific Rim. I'm not smart enough to know, I'm not well-versed enough to know whether that's because China is spoiling for military engagement, but my gut tells me is that their calculation, as is the case with Russia and Ukraine, is that the US does not have an appetite for military engagement and will continue to push us and continue to test us, whether it's through more overt engagement as we see in the South China Sea, through human rights violations as we see in the northwestern part of that country, or through increasingly aggressive efforts in Hong Kong and Taiwan. I think, as a non-expert, that China is testing us to see whether we're willing to push back and to what degree. I don't know whether that's something that leads to military engagement or just more hostile economic and much more hostile economic and diplomatic situation. When Kevin Rudd, the former Australian Prime Minister, talked about international anarchy in his foreign affairs piece, he wasn't talking about war per se, but he was talking about the chaos that would exist economically, diplomatically, and on so many other fronts.
Thank you. This might be a tough question, but do you know what proportion of our national debt is held by China? I don't know if you have that statistic or not.
I do not have that statistic at hand. It's a growing percentage, and once again, we get back to the trade-offs that we were discussing earlier. In order to purchase large amounts of cheap consumer products from China, we make other trade-offs, and this is certainly one of them.
Thank you. And what do you think would be the percentage of Americans that would want the US to lead a global effort to address the pandemic?
What percentage of Americans do I think would support the US involvement to lead the global effort against the pandemic? I don't think, well, I'll take that back. I think on a question framed that way, I think most voters would say, yes, we do want to take the US take a leadership role because we have to defeat this challenge. That said, the question that I just phrased is probably not the one that most American voters are considering right now. And their question is, the question they're answering or thinking through is, should we be taking care of Americans suffering from this pandemic first? Should we be concentrating on protecting American citizens first before lending our efforts to the rest of the world? And I think those numbers would twist in a different direction. I think you can tell by the way I answered the question that I personally am a lot more inclined in the direction that the questioner raised. But I think it is worth recognizing that while the question that was asked would lead to a lot of support, most Americans, the majority of Americans, according to public opinion polling, while they generally do like the idea of the US taking a greater role in the world, they're suspicious of it in a time of pandemic, just like they were after the World Wars and the Great Depression and the Great Recession.
Thank you. Do you think we have learned some lessons, such as not having all of our manufacturing, et cetera, made in basically one country?
I think we have learned our lesson. And the most noticeable aspect of that discussion is the amount of necessary medical supplies that the United States uses that come from China. But it does seem to have engendered a broader conversation, not just about the manufacturing of medical supplies and equipment in particular, but more broadly, our reliance on Chinese manufacturing. Now, ironically enough, as you know, Jessica, our dependence on China's manufacturing in recent years has ironically lessened to some degree, as China has, to some degree, begun to improve its own labor practices. But those jobs haven't been moving back to the United States. Rather, they've been moving to other countries on the Pacific Rim that have not begun to improve their own labor standards. So it's important to remember that as confrontational as the US and China relationship is becoming, this question of manufacturing supply chains is one that's not just limited to China. It's a much broader challenge from other countries on who we rely to do the manufacturing a lot more cheaply there than we could afford to do here.
All right, kind of going a little bit more domestic now. What are your thoughts on California Governor Newsom's recent coronavirus actions on Orange County beaches and the phase 2 reopening?
Boy, Gavin Newsom has been really interesting to watch throughout this crisis. And California voters, large majorities of California voters, with whom I would agree, give him very high marks on his handling of the virus. There certainly have been challenges. Very serious questions have emerged about some of the larger contracts for medical supplies that the state of California has signed under questionable circumstances. And state legislators of both parties have been very unhappy that Newsom's administration has not been more willing to share the details of those deals with legislative leaders. That said, the voters give him very high marks, and I think the reason for that, Jessica, more than any other, is that they see him as attempting to lead through this crisis in as nonpartisan a manner as possible. One of the things we've learned in past crises in California and elsewhere, earthquakes and fires here, wars and recessions more nationally, is that when people are really frightened by a disaster, natural or man-made, they want their politicians to put aside partisanship and work together. Newsom is no fan of Donald Trump's. In fact, you could argue that he became the president's critic in chief here in California during Newsom's first year in office. But through this pandemic, Newsom has been much more measured in his comments about the president and the administration, and often has given careful praise to the Trump administration when it's been cooperative. In my own opinion, is that even for Californians who do not care for Trump all that much, they do want to see their leaders putting aside partisanship in times of crisis. Years and years ago, after the Northridge earthquake, then Republican Governor Pete Wilson and then Democratic President Bill Clinton, who did not care for each other much at all, publicly at least put aside their differences in order to work together on the post-Northridge recovery. And not only did the state of California benefit from that, but both men benefited politically. By contrast, after Hurricane Katrina, some years later, Republican President George W. Bush and a Democratic governor of Louisiana, Kathleen Blanco, were much less cooperative in working on New Orleans and Louisiana's recovery. A lot of finger pointing, a lot of blame laying. And not only did New Orleans suffer as a result of that, but both Bush and Blanco, both the Republican and the Democratic president, were hurt very much politically because voters didn't see them as willing to work together. Newsom has figured out that as unpopular as Trump is here, it is in Newsom's interest and the state's interest to do whatever he can to work with the administration. And I think that's worked to his benefit, to our benefit, both substantively and politically. But the real challenge going forward is the reopening. And as more and more communities around the state are getting more and more restive and more eager, and more restless to open up, it's going to become more and more challenging for Newsom to walk the line between encouraging a slower reopening without getting into overly confrontational situations with local leaders in other parts of the state. It's a long way of saying so far so good, but the biggest test is just beginning to emerge for the governor.
Thank you. And you and I were talking before the webinar started about the unity government that was established in Israel, basically to be a national response government. So there's something to that desire for two sides to come together to address something like this.
Well, particularly in crisis, yeah.
Yeah. How are people that are observing stay-at-home orders able to protest against those pushing for reopening when the concept of public gatherings and protests is contrary to the social distancing practice? Is there some place online for speaking out against those pushing to reopen too soon?
Well, the most responsible protests I've seen, whether in favor of reopening or on any other topic, have been automotive based. And there have been any number of protests here in Los Angeles, up at the state capitol in Sacramento, where unhappy citizens, whether it's because of the reopening or other public policy challenges, have essentially protested from their cars. That said, it doesn't have nearly the same kind of visceral and emotive impact as protesting in person. And as we've seen in Sacramento and around the state, more and more people are willing to flout social distancing practices in order to have their voices heard. My own opinion is that that's extremely irresponsible. I don't have any problem with someone protesting, but I think you can protest, maybe even more effectively, and to greater emotive impact, protesting outside the state capitol or city hall, wearing a mask and standing at 6-foot distances from others. I think that picture is a particularly compelling one for television news and online video to cover. So although it's probably not much you or I can do anything about right now, my hope is for even those people who are most upset and most angry and most impacted by the shutdown, exercise their right to protest in a much, much more responsible way.
Thank you. And this will be our final question. Going back to China, how do you feel about us buying so much virus supplies from China after them being so evasive about the virus earlier?
Boy, there's going to be a price for China to pay. As I mentioned earlier, it's not just the United States that is questioning the way the Chinese have responded to questions about the origins of the virus. There's countries throughout the world that are pushing back. China, interestingly, their response to these questions and these challenges has been very aggressive. There's a new generation of diplomats from China. They're called the Wolf Warriors, after a popular action movie that was made in China some years back. And these diplomats are much more aggressive, much more confrontational in their pushback. And European countries, Australia, New Zealand, other Asian Pacific countries are hearing, at least very rhetorically, very aggressive pushback from the Chinese. On one hand, the Chinese government is working very hard to provide support, medical supplies, aid, and other necessary equipment to countries all over the world that are struggling to face this pandemic on their own. And they, the Chinese government, are hoping to reap tremendous benefits from those efforts. But I wonder if a lot of those efforts aren't being undermined because they're pushing back so hard against what I would argue are very legitimate questions, not just from the US, but from other countries, about why the Chinese are not willing to be more forthcoming and more cooperative in fighting a global challenge.
Thank you so much, Dan. This is a fascinating talk, and I'm all about world affairs, so I love talking about this topic today. I think Kim's going to come back and join us. All right.
Hi, Dan. Hi, Jessica. Dan, that was fabulous. I loved it.
Thank you so much.
One of the best parts of my week is hearing, getting enlightening information from you. And thank you to all of our viewers for joining us today. We have a terrific lineup of live streams next week. May 12th, we have former California Governor Jerry Brown, who will be with us with Jim Newton, an award-winning journalist, talking about what Jerry Brown learned while governing California, as well as his advice for US governors who are facing the toughest decisions of their political careers. On May 13th, we have the Consul General from Israel, who will be talking about how his country is preparing for a very uncertain future. And we have Dan back on May 14th with politics in the time of coronavirus. And then on May 18th, we are going to be discussing the potential end of the lockdown with Catherine Barger, LA County Supervisor and Board Chair, and Dr. Barbara Farrar, Director of the LA County Department of Public Health. There's a tab on the right-hand side of your screen that says handouts. If you click on that, you can see a whole list of all of our upcoming programs. So please register today, especially for Dan's great series, and stay safe, be well, and we'll see you soon. Dan, thank you so much again. This was fabulous. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you next week, and I'm very excited to watch the rest of the programming you talked about. What a great lineup.
Thank you. Take care, everyone. Take care.